At temples like this in China and Japan, Zen meditation and philosophy developed over the centuries. Nowadays, Zen is practiced and studied around the world by ordinary and extraordinary people.
My tutelary bodhisattva, Fudo Myo.
This small, gentle man, D.T. Suzuki, is credited with introducing Zen to the West. Zero and infinity, life and death are one and the same. Reality, as we perceive it, is an illusion. So is the concept of our self. This philosophy is impossible to explain, he said. Yet he wrote about Zen and Buddhism in more than 100 books. And often lectured to Western audiences.
Has not been going on at all.
Many renowned thinkers, artists, theologians, and psychologists were strongly affected by his teachings.
He's probably the most culturally significant Japanese person in international terms in all of history.
He just made Buddhism burst like a bomb on America.
If you read his books carefully, they are filled with the most profitable kind of doubt.
Born soon after the Meiji Restoration, Teitaro Suzuki was witness to many historic events in his lifetime, which spanned almost 96 years. Japan had been closed to the outside world for over 200 years and modernized at a breathtaking pace based on Western models. With conflicting interests in Asia, Japan attacked Russia in 1904 and was victorious. Upheaval in Russia culminated in a Marxist revolution with a promise of state control by the working class. Teitaro Suzuki lived in the United States from 1897 through 1908. Some American intellectuals showed growing interest in the Orient. But there was also overt discrimination against Asians. Many Westerners believed science was almighty, yet the Industrial Revolution had ravaged the environment. Very soon, the globe was engulfed in the First World War, called the War to End All Wars. But a Second World War followed, with unprecedented horrors. Japan brought the United States into the war at a late stage, when it attacked Pearl Harbor. America prevailed. After atomic bombings of the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Emperor made a radio announcement that they had lost the war. D.T. Suzuki was 75. He would live another 20 years, during which two bitter wars would be fought in Asia, involving America and its allies. These were also years Westerners looked increasingly to the East for spiritual inspiration. They found this in the works and the person of D.T. Suzuki. The story of why and how this individual, more than any other, opened the West to Zen and the Eastern way of being begins in the small, snowbound town of Kanazawa. Teitaro Suzuki was born here in 1870, the last of 5 children. His father, a physician in the court of the local feudal lord, loses his stipends after the samurai class is abolished. He dies when Teitaro is 6. A year later, Teitaro's elder brother dies as well. The family can no longer afford to send Teitaro to school. He studies English on his own and teaches it at local elementary schools until his mother dies when he is 20. Deeply troubled, Teitaro questions the meaning of life. This leads him to study Zen at Enkakuji Temple in Kitakamakura, under Zen master Shaku Soen. Aware of Teitaro's English ability, Shaku Soen has Suzuki translate a talk he is to give at the Parliament of Religions, part of the 1893 World's Fair in Chicago. This is the first time Eastern religious leaders have an opportunity to directly explain their philosophies to a Western audience.
A man called Paul Karras met Soen Shaku and was very impressed with Buddhism and what he told him about Zen. And at the time, Paul Karras had a publishing house called the Open Court Publishing Company.
The following year, Paul Karras asks Shaku Soen to arrange for a Japanese translation of a book that he has edited, The Gospel of Buddha. The task falls to Suzuki, and the Japanese version is well received. Paul Karras decides to hire Suzuki to assist him at Open Court Publishing in LaSalle, Illinois. But Teitaro is faced with another personal dilemma. Zen meditation has not resulted in his experiencing Satori, Zen enlightenment. He delays his departure twice and becomes more and more desperate.
Then finally it happened, and what it was walking up these same old stairs towards the mountain gate. And he said as he walked up the stairs, he said, I had the conviction that I was the same as the trees on the side of the stairs. And it wasn't that I had stopped being myself, but I was the trees.
Shaku Soen gives Suzuki the Zen name Daisetsu, which means absolute simplicity. After a further delay when his ship is quarantined due to a case of tuberculosis on board, Suzuki enters the United States in 1897, aged 27. He moves to LaSalle, living with the Ramsey family in this house, with their 4 rambunctious daughters. Having to adjust to these strong-willed Western women, Teitaro wonders whether he will ever marry at all. Suzuki works for Open Court Publishing for the following 10 years, translating from Chinese and Sanskrit for Paul Karras, and begins his own writing.
One day I remember him working with my father to developing pictures, helping my father. In those days, in 1907 or 8, why people developed their own pictures.
Suzuki becomes equally at ease in front of and behind the camera, and even considers a career as a photographer. But introducing Zen Buddhism to the West has already become his life work.
We in London, interested in Buddhism, knew a great deal about the Theravada school of Ceylon, Burma, and Siam, and something of Buddhism of Tibet. We knew nothing of Zen Buddhism and very little of Mahayana philosophy.
In 1905 and 6, Shaku Soen travels across the United States with Daisetsu Suzuki as interpreter. At one of these lectures, Suzuki meets Beatrice Erskine Lane, a Radcliffe graduate. Beatrice is interested in theosophy and Baha'i, which opened her to the rich wisdom of Eastern philosophy. They write to each other constantly, and their relationship blossoms. Suzuki spends the following year traveling and researching, mostly in Europe. He is invited to translate, while in London, Emanuel Swedenborg's Heaven and Hell into Japanese. Daisetsu Suzuki moves back to Japan in 1909. He continues Zen practice with Shakusoen until his master's death. His best friend from school days, the philosopher Nishida Kitaro, arranges for Suzuki to teach English at Gakushuin, a school for aristocrats' children. He also becomes a dorm master. Many of his students go on to become renowned artists, writers, civil servants, and business leaders. At the same time, he teaches at Tokyo Imperial University. Beatrice joins him in Japan in 1911, and they are married in Yokohama. English is the language they use at home. In 1916, the Suzukis adopt a Japanese infant, Alan Masaru, whose father is Scottish. This is an era when children who look foreign face enormous difficulties in Japan. Daisetsu himself is ill at ease with increasing nationalism. Nishida Kitaro arranges for both the Suzukis to teach at Shin Buddhist-related Otani University in Kyoto, beginning in 1921. Daisetsu gives courses in comparative religion, and Beatrice teaches English. After Suzuki receives a doctoral degree from Otani University, he publishes two classics in 1934 and 35, A Manual of Zen Buddhism and the companion, An Introduction to Zen Buddhism, with a foreword by psychologist Carl Jung.
In 1936, Dr. Suzuki again came to London and was present at the founding meeting of the World Congress of Faiths, at which his own speech was memorable to all who heard it, and was perhaps the finest of all those given on that great occasion.
Here, Christmas Humphreys and Alan Watts, only 19, meet D.T. Suzuki, who leaves a lasting impression on the two. Alan Watts is subsequently ordained as an Episcopalian minister in the United States, but leaves that for his first calling, as a proponent of Zen. Later on, Christmas Humphreys, founder of the Buddhist Society in London, republishes many of D.T. Suzuki's writings.
Buddhism was coming over the horizon through the books of Daisetsu Suzuki. And they swept me off my feet. And to be frank, the reason that they did was his accounts of Satori, the awakening experience.
Dr. Suzuki, does life have any meaning, or is it a tale told by an idiot, a play of blind impulses or brute forces?
I can't say it's a brute force or blind or idiotic. Life has meaning, but I like to say life is meaning. When we talk about life has meaning, that presupposes that there's something outside life which makes life meaningful. But when I say life is meaning, there's no need of seeking meaning outside.
I wanted that more than anything else, a direct revelation or disclosure of the nature of things.
In practical life, as long as we live in a relative world, we get attached to something good, to something bad, something beautiful, or something not so very beautiful. We get attached to the dualistic view of reality. But underneath, or in or with the relative world, we have another world which is not relative, which transcends it, but at the same time in it, that is with the relative world. And that world I may call a transcendental realm. In that world there is no attachment. There is no good, no evil, no beauty, or no ugliness.
Bringing the opposite together. That's not the way it seems most of the time, but that's the way it is. Coming to see that in every moment would be the realization of a master.
What is the place of suffering in human life?
The suffering is to bring out what is deeply buried underneath. Without suffering, we are not conscious of that something.
Should we try to overcome suffering?
Yes, the sufferings are meant to be overcome.
Can we overcome
Yes,
it?
we can overcome.
Can we reach a point where suffering in life is altogether transcended?
Well, in this sense, when we say suffering is to be transcended or overcome, that does not mean to do away with sufferings altogether. We suffer, and yet we don't suffer. That's the way to overcome suffering.
In 1938, Beatrice becomes very ill. Daisetsu declines an invitation to the first East-West Philosophers Conference in Hawaii to be with her. She passes away the following year. Dr. Suzuki stops teaching in 1940. Despite difficulties he faces during the Second World War, he arranges construction of a library devoted to Buddhist studies, Matsugaoka Bunko, in Tokeiji Temple.
From the top of this mountain, you could see a military facility at Ofuna Port. We were told we couldn't get a permit because it would be possible to watch what was going on down there. They said it would be all right if we erected a large fence to shut out the view. When I came back and told Dr. Suzuki, he got angry and said they were just bossing us around. He had been opposed to the war from the start, saying it was ridiculous to fight against the United States.
Isolated from his friends overseas, Suzuki continues writing in Japanese, for publication later in English.
In a speech at a ceremony for Otani University students conscripted and being sent to the front, Dr. Suzuki said that was truly unfortunate. What reason is there for young Americans and young Japanese to kill each other? This ridiculous war will surely end one day. After the war, it is young people like you who will have to rebuild the world. That's why you must not die. Even if it means becoming prisoners of war, you must come back alive.
With R.H. Blythe seen here tutoring the Crown Prince after the war, Suzuki co-edits a magazine called The Cultural East. In 1947, Daisetsu Suzuki is invited to give 2 lectures about Buddhism to the emperor, who had renounced his status as a Shinto god 2 years earlier. This book is the result of those talks.
It was kind of interesting, his reaction. He said the emperor was very polite. He listened. But I think the empress really understood what I was talking about.
In 1949, Dr. Suzuki is invited to the second East-West Philosophers Conference, then teaches for 3 months at the University of Hawaii.
I remember sitting there in the audience, listening to this gentle, kindly old man up there on the podium, not understanding a word he was saying, not a word. And I suddenly had the image that he was there weaving a tapestry. And it was totally coherent from his side. But we were on the other side of the tapestry, and we only saw these odd threads sticking through, poking through.
I never had the feeling, particularly, I didn't understand him. I was aware of the teachings that I had absorbed, I think, in part from Sensei and others, that you don't have to understand everything.
When I talk with Western people, generally, they say, Zen is impossible to understand. To understand means intellectual grasping, comprehending it. But Zen is not to be intellectually or conceptually or logically or dialectically or any other kind of kali to grasp.
When you speak of Buddhism, it's not East or West. In fact, I went to one of the lectures, and the first word he said was, there is no East, there is no West.
As stated in East and West, this has been going on to a great extent in various ways. But mostly, as far as I can see in history, East has been exploited by the West, economically, politically, so far. And it is only after the last war that West has really earnestly begun to study what East is, what East means, what Eastern culture stands for.
It took maybe America dropping the atomic bomb for the West to become interested in Zen, almost out of guilt.
Americans are not to be repentful of this. Humanity of mankind itself is to be responsible for all this.
From 1951 through 1957, Dr. Suzuki gives a celebrated series of open classes at Columbia University. They're filled to capacity, attended by many well-known artists, writers, and psychoanalysts.
I had the good fortune to attend the classes of Suzuki Daisetsu at Columbia University, who was explaining his view of the philosophy of Zen Buddhism. And it was very important for me what he had to say about the structure of the mind, and also about the fact that all beings, whether sentient, having sense perceptions as we do, or non-sentient as rocks, that all beings are at the center of the universe, and that these are in interpenetration. So it gave me, for instance, in the field of music, the idea that sounds were equal, rather than one sound being more important than the others. And I try to give, to make a music that lets each sound be heard, not as subservient to other sounds, but as equal.
In 1952, a Japanese-American teenager, Mihoko Okamura, visits Suzuki after one of his talks in New York. Suzuki is 82.
Because I was a teenager and very much troubled with myself and the world around me, what I did was tell him about my complaints. I told him I looked around me and I couldn't find any grown-ups that I could emulate. And so why should I go on living, said I to him, I remember. He said, you must have faith in yourself. And I didn't understand for a long while what the self that he thought that I should have faith in meant. The self that he was telling me about was the self of all selves in the universe.
Daisetsu Suzuki's teachings transform Mihoko's life, and she decides to devote herself to helping him. Her parents invite Dr. Suzuki to move out of Butler Hall, his residence at Columbia University, and stay in their home where he can be well cared for. Several years later, Mihoko becomes Dr. Suzuki's secretary and accompanies him on his travels around the world, eventually moving to Japan.
Jack Kerouac and Allen Ginsberg went to visit Dr. Suzuki one time when he was in New York.
Suzuki's writings through Alan Watts was a kind of springboard for them to do their own things. And Snyder was the only one who took that springboard seriously and didn't try just to use that impetus for his own thing, but tried to get back to the source.
Obviously, they were trying to impress him with what they understood, and he wasn't impressed.
Individuals who were identified with the Beat generation of all sorts were a pretty rowdy bunch and had a wide range of values and intentions. And what you can say in their favor is they had a lot of enthusiasm and experimented and took things in a lot of directions. Actually, I think American Buddhism is in a great debt to the Beat generation.
I remember one time interviewing Joe Campbell, and what he felt was one of the greatest gifts that he got from the 7 months that he spent in Japan in the mid-1950s, a time when he had several encounters with Daisetsu Suzuki, a man he deeply honored and revered. And Joe surprised me with a very succinct but elegant answer. He said, a sense of form. If you learn form, you can find a great deal of freedom within the form. But if you try to go for the freedom without the form, you have anarchy.
In this age of globalization, what is the right balance between freedom, openness, and form? And there has to be some, because if you have too little freedom, then you get dogmatic and rigid. If you have too little form, it's a bumpless slope down the path of relativism, and relativism is an unlivable philosophy.
If you once penetrate by detachment and purity of heart to the inner secret of the ground of one's ordinary experience, you attain to a liberty which nobody can touch.
Real freedom is to see things as they are, to see things in their suchness, as we would say. That is freedom.
In 1953 and 54, Suzuki attends the Iranos Conference in Switzerland, a gathering of distinguished thinkers. He spends time with Carl Jung, Martin Heidegger, and Karl Jaspers, and lectures all around Europe. In 1957, when Dr. Suzuki is living in Boston, a group of people approach him to head a meditation center they wish to start. He accepts the presidency, but it is his good friend Dr. Hisamatsu Shinichi who leads them in Zen meditation.
somehow or other, Dr. Suzuki, the drugs, the 60s, everything all came together in a way that seemed to favor the practice of Zen.
At some point after Dr. Suzuki arrived in New York, he heard about psychedelic agents, and he became very interested in them. And there was a lot of talk about them among young hippies and as part of the Zen boom. And you didn't really need to do all this meditation. You just took LSD and everything opened up. And so he got very interested, and he asked me if I could get some LSD for him.
There was so much talk about LSD being related to Zen Buddhism that he felt that he needed to have first-hand experience with the drug. Otherwise, he didn't feel that he could talk about it or to even have any ideas about it.
You know, everybody was taking LSD was 19 or 22, and what would an 85-year-old man, how would he respond? So we decided it'd be better to talk him out of it, and so we did that, and I think we used his blood pressure as an excuse.
Zen followers or Zen men don't follow Buddha. Zen men make Buddha follow them.
When I was in Kamakura, I called on Dr. Suzuki, and he was appalled at my physical condition and just took me in. And I stayed with him for about 3 weeks, I think, 2 weeks maybe. And Soen Roshi came to see me. And Suzuki scolded him roundly for not looking after me better, for not understanding that Westerners have different needs and different tolerances.
Zazen is a kind of going to hell. Sure. There ought not to be any Zazen. Just as we are, all right.
In the morning, when I arrived, I would enter Dr. Suzuki's study and call out, "Good morning, Sensei." Sometimes I don't see him anywhere. Worried, I go looking for him and find him in the corner of a room, sitting, doing Zazen meditation. I think to myself, oh, he's meditating, and go quietly to my own workplace. The fact is, he sat in Zazen like that for many years, from an early age, and meditation continued to be an integral part of his daily life.
Dr. Suzuki never wanted to become a monk. He married, he lived a lay life.
He was a naturally devotional person.
To be devotional means to take great pleasure in the universe as it is, and to have a deep, deep faith. So deep a faith that you can also have doubt it doesn't matter. I think he really was there.
In his 50s, D.T. Suzuki widens the scope of his lectures and writings to encompass Jodo Shinshu, known in English as Pure Land Buddhism.
I think it may have had to do with this concern he had with wisdom and compassion, and that Zen was too preoccupied with wisdom and seeing things truly, and not so much with compassion. And when he looked at Pure Land Buddhism, it struck him as being a major theme was compassion.
While Zen emphasizes self-effort to achieve enlightenment, Shin Buddhism starts out with absolute dependence on the Buddha to reach the same end.
Everyone who does Zen practice comes to recognize the fact that their desire to work hard and accomplish something stands in their own way. You get in your own way. This is the way Zen works on you, is to make you get in your own way and then make you learn to get out of your own way. In Jodo Shin, they start from a slightly different angle and say, try not getting in your own way. Give up any thought of accomplishing anything. Give it up. Have you given it up yet? It's a wonderful, in its own way, it's his own kind of double mind. It's a very sweet double mind.
Jiriki, meaning self-power, is your own self-effort to search for your ultimate self or your real self. But once you find your real self, once you come in contact or direct contact with it, you realize that it was the other power that gave you the ability to encounter or grasp it.
Morimoto Roshi one time said to me when we were having a little conversation, he said, Jodo Shin is like, if Rinzai is the husband, Jodo Shin is the wife. And Jodo Shin knows all of our flaws, knows what our real deep mistakes are. Jodo Shin really challenges us with the call to not try to accomplish anything. And I think Suzuki reached that point too.
Buddhism is a eternal negation, endless negation. If you think you are enlightened, then it is the beginning of stagnation, mental stagnation.
Any position you may have or any idea you may cherish, Zen wants to destroy it. In fact, Zen denies everything we do, everything we say, everything we write. But at the same time, Zen writes, Zen speaks, and Zen acts, does all kinds of things.
I first met Suzuki here in Tokyo. He was giving a talk on Pure Land Buddhism, and I went with Father Dumoulin. And it was a beautiful talk. In fact, Father Dumoulin said to me afterwards, that was like a talk on the Sacred Heart, on the love of God, on the mercy of God.
In conventional Christianity, in mysticism, it is a matter of forgetting the self and merging with the deity. In Buddhism, it is a matter of simply forgetting the self. And in those ways, the two paths are not so different.
Il ne faut plus juger le bouddhisme d'après ce qui est secondaire et bas, mais au contraire, trouver ce qui est le plus riche et le plus valable pour nous. Alors ça, c'est par exemple dans le zen et dans ce qu'il y a de plus avancé dans la méditation, n'est-ce pas?
Buddhists will accept sinners unconditionally. Not only human beings, but this salvation was to be extended to so-called inanimate beings, non-sentient beings. So universal salvation did not mean just human beings, but animals. They are all to be saved. Not only that, but mountains, trees we see outside, and the rocks, earth, the rivers, and all those things were to be saved.
He used to come back time and again to Meister Eckhart, and really had been very impressed with him and with other Christian mystical thinkers. One quotation from Meister Eckhart that he used to love to repeat was, the eye with which I see God is the same as the eye with which God sees me. And he said, oh, this man had a wonderful understanding of Zen.
Buddhism was introduced to Japan in the middle of 6th century. And Dr. Suzuki says that Japanese Buddhism truly became Japanese in the 13th century. That is about 650 years after the introduction.
One ought not to be in a hurry. It may take 100 or 200, 300 years to have Zen really planted in the West. Not in a hurry, but as long as I live, I must do my best.
Once, when Dr. Suzuki returned to Japan for a visit, one of the Japanese students welcoming him asked whether it was possible for Americans to understand Buddhism. Dr. Suzuki replied, "Do you think you understand Buddhism?"
Well, I don't even know if I have a correct understanding of Zen. And it doesn't trouble me. I know what I think I know. I think I know what I think I know. And it is a great fun working with it.
Suppose we all became converts to Zen Buddhism.
Yes.
What would be the effect on the human race? Would we live any differently?
Turned into Zen monks, there will be no marriage or no giving birth to children. Is that what you mean?
I do think that Buddhism has been the most peaceful religion. And if we need anything that will lift us in the direction of peace in this war-torn, terroristic time, why, there one finds resources that it would be a tragedy to lose.
At one point, I was taking a course in New York at the new school on psychoanalysis that was being given by Erich Fromm, who had been one of my heroes in the psychoanalytic movement. And increasingly, in his lectures, he referred to Zen, more and more to Zen. And so after one of the lectures, I went up and said that I was really impressed with how much he talked about Zen and what had been his experience with it. And he said, well, really, I haven't had any experience except reading books, turned out particularly books by D.T. Suzuki. And I said, well, have you ever met him? And he said, no. No, I've never met him. Isn't he in Japan? And I said, actually, he's just up the street in New York.
Dr. Albert Stunkard brought Erich Fromm over to meet Dr. Suzuki for the first time. And Dr. Fromm said, Dr. Suzuki, I have a question for you. I'm just coming from having read Zen and the Art of Archery by Eugen Herrigel. Now, how is it that a religion, Zen being a religion, has anything to do with weapons, such as archery or even sword, which has to do with killing people? And he was quite visibly upset. This was a question which seems to have been very close to his person. Dr. Suzuki then said, well, Dr. Fromm, who are you who asks that question? Dr. Fromm then got up and said, well, Dr. Suzuki, I can't talk to you anymore. That's as if it was obvious that he had nothing more to say to him. And he left the house.
Zen masters tell us that the answer is in the question itself. You look into your question yourself. My answering only leads you further away from your question.
About 2 weeks thereafter, there was a telephone call to Dr. Suzuki saying, please tell Dr. Suzuki that I've been thinking about your question for the last 2 weeks, sometimes without sleep. And I think I now have the answer. Would you be kind enough to see me once more? And indeed, they did meet once more, and this was the beginning of a most profound and amicable friendship.
Erich Fromm mounted a week-long summer seminar of 50 psychiatrists meeting with Daisetsu Suzuki.
These were all psychoanalysts, almost, maybe all of them from New York City, and they all came down full of their knowledge of Zen, and Dr. Suzuki was very quiet and didn't say much. And then over the 3 days or so of the meeting, everything kind of calmed down. And it was a little like this aura of Dr. Suzuki that kind of spread out, and people stopped being so self-important and challenging each other about how much they knew about Zen, because I don't think any of them knew anything about Zen.
What was interesting was that many people who came and visited him often didn't notice anything remarkable about him. And it took me a while to understand that this was an ultimate achievement, not to be noticed in particular, was the ultimate achievement of Buddhism.
Is our ideal to overcome the ego?
Yes. Ego is there to be overcome. Yes.
When one overcomes this, does one lose one's individuality?
That's where its difficulty comes in. To overcome does not mean ego is annihilated altogether and becomes like a piece of wood. Not that. Ego is there.
It is there.
Yes.
But how is it different?
The difference is one is conscious of it. That is, ego is not the real one.
Buddhist teaching is to make each person independent unto himself, self-reliant. Self-reliance is what Buddhism teaches. And therefore, to be in touch with your true self is the business of being a Buddhist.
Both Christianity and Buddhism agree that the root of man's problems is that his consciousness is all fouled up, and that he does not apprehend reality as it fully and really is. That the moment he looks at something, he begins to interpret it in ways which are prejudiced and predetermined to fit a certain wrong picture of the world in which he is, as an individual ego, in the center of things.
The Buddhist way of doing away with ego is this. Ego has no existence whatever from the very beginning.
Erich Fromm feels he has much to learn from Dr. Suzuki and invites him to spend his remaining years in comfortable surroundings at Fromm's villa in Mexico. But after retiring from Columbia University, Daisetsu Suzuki returns to Japan with Miss Okamura to base himself at his library in Kitakamakura, where he feels at home. He devotes himself anew to translation and writing. In his 90s, Suzuki remains active with numerous visitors. He also travels extensively. In 1959, he is invited to the Third East-West Philosophers Conference, where he receives an honorary doctorate. To stay in shape, Daisetsu enjoys gardening and takes daily walks along the path below his study, placing stones at either end to keep count of the number of times he has gone back and forth. Despite loss of hearing and high blood pressure, his overall health is excellent.
He said, the other problem is that I can't concentrate as long as I used to be able to. He said, I used to just be able to sit and work all day. And he said, but now, after a couple of hours, I begin to get restless and feel I have to have a break. And the way I handle that is to be working on 3 projects at the same time. So when I get restless with one project, maybe after 2 hours, then I take a break and I work on another project. And then when I get restless, I work on another. And I thought at the time, my God, he can only concentrate for 2 hours.
In 1960, he is invited to India as a state guest and visits Nepal. Daisetsu is fascinated, as always, experiencing firsthand the land where Buddhism was born. At the age of 94, Suzuki travels to New York, where he meets with Paul Tillich and Father Thomas Merton, and to Hawaii to attend the 4th East-West Philosophers Conference.
One of the things that impressed me about Suzuki was how much he understood about Western philosophy. And this was very reassuring as we got into all these kind of crazy Zen ideas.
Be and at the same time not be. Or to be or not to be, but then to be and not to be. Both at the same time.
You don't think that it's inevitable that man, realizing that after 70, 80 years must die, it's not necessary for him to think about his death and what happens thereafter?
Exactly.
He doesn't have to think about it.
No. 70 years or 80 years or 100 years, well, that concerns time. But when we are living itself is not in time.
It is not in time. The days come and go.
Yes.
This seems like time.
Yes, that's the way somebody thinks. Somebody standing or imagining that somebody is outside time. But if we go on with time itself, well, there is no such question whether we survive or not.
The best thing is to be living and yet not living, dying yet not dying. That is the object of Zen discipline.
Socrates and Plato just focus so strongly on that. Philosophy is the art of dying.
I'm sure, Dr. Suzuki, you're acquainted with the nonviolent ideas of Gandhi.
Yes.
Could you comment on what judgment Zen makes of these ideas of nonviolence?
Well, it's a very important idea, but at the same time, that cannot be practiced unconditionally. For instance, we are all freedom-loving people, and Russians may have something to say against our way of practicing it. Russians are making people slaves of political machinery. When it is a question of the whole group of people, and that group is altogether annihilated, in that case, violence is to be met with violence.
Yes. No life, no death. No oot, no moot, no being, no non-being, no killing, no non-killing. How do we understand that? It would be a mistake. It would be a very deep mistake to think, having understood that, I can kill something. Having understood that, you choose not to kill something. Unless you have to.
From a certain point of view, God made a great mistake to create this world. He never expected human beings like this. He is quite sorry about it. I'm quite sure about it. And those who like to destroy themselves, let them do their work. Somebody will be left. It takes so many thousands or million years. But still, from the point of view of eternity or infinity, or millions, or billions, or trillions, not nothing.
Unless one is accommodated to the fact that life and death are the same thing, what happens when you die?
Suzuki was speaking about the Pure Land and about the happiness after death. And then one of the audience said, "But Dr. Suzuki, you've contradicted yourself speaking about life after death." And Suzuki looked up and he smiled and he said, "But there's no such thing as death." And I was surprised at the time, but now I see that that is the great enlightenment. Life and death are not two things, but one.
Suzuki spends his summers in the mountain resort of Karuizawa. Here, the cooler weather allows him to continue his studies and writing. He is working on another mammoth translation project, the Kyogyo Shinsho, core text of Pure Land Buddhism. Just before his 96th birthday, Daisetsu Suzuki suffers a strangulation of the intestine. It takes 3 hours to get him to St. Luke's Hospital in Tokyo, by which time it is too late to operate on him. He dies the following day.
And when he died, it seemed that there was nothing particularly different from the time that I knew him to when he was alive. There was no demarcation line, I would say. No line that can be drawn between what he calls life and death. And I realized that there was such a way of living, to be alive while being thoroughly dead is the Zen way.
We have never lost paradise, but human consciousness tells us we have lost it, and we have to regain it. But in fact, paradise has never been lost. Paradise is never to be, therefore, regained. We are in Eden just as we are now.
Wilt u naar aanleiding van deze uitzending reageren of een gratis programmagids bestellen? Bezoek dan onze website boeddhistischeomroep.nl. DVD's van onze programma's kunt u bestellen op 010 411 3977.